Thanks for joining us today at Cheating Tales Lab. We're excited to share another great story with you. Hope you enjoy it as much as we did creating it. Now, let's get started. Matthew Holt stood outside his home, the weight of his duffel bag nothing compared to the burden of the past 18 months. His fingers tightened around the strap, knuckles white with anticipation. The porch light flickered, casting an eerie glow on the once familiar facade. Something felt off, but he couldn't quite place it. He took a deep breath, wincing as pain shot through his side. The doctors had warned him about pushing too hard, but this was different. This was home. The thought of seeing Amanda and Jacob had sustained him through the brutality of war. Now, mere feet away from reunion, an inexplicable dread crept over him. Matthew pushed open the front door, the creak of hinges unnaturally loud in the silence. The scent hit him first, a cologne he didn't recognize, masculine and invasive. His eyes darted around the living room, taking in the rearranged furniture, the bare spots on the walls where family photos used to hang. It was as if someone had systematically erased him from the home. Before he could process the changes, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. A shirtless man strode out, muscular and oozing confidence. Nick, as Matthew would soon learn, sneered at the soldier. "I'm the owner of this property now," he said, crossing his arms. "You need to leave before I call the cops." Matthew's mind reeled. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with disbelief. The sound of bare feet padding across hardwood drew Matthew's attention. Amanda emerged from the back, wrapped in a silk robe. Her eyes widened for a split second before her face settled into a mask of cold indifference. "Oh, you're home early," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. "Listen, Matthew, you need to go. He's right. You don't live here anymore. If you don't leave, I'll call the cops for trespassing." The betrayal stung, but Matthew's thoughts immediately went to his son. "Where's Jacob? Tell him I'm home." Amanda's expression softened for a brief moment, a flicker of the woman he once knew. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Jacob's gone. He got into trouble and left town. He's been gone for months, Matthew. I don't know where he is." The news knocked the wind out of him. Matthew stared at Amanda and Nick, taking in every detail of their betrayal. The arrogance radiating from Nick, the cold detachment in Amanda's eyes. It would have been enough to send most men into a rage. But Matthew, trained to think under pressure, remained outwardly calm. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out of the house. The door clicked shut behind him, eerily final. Matthew drove aimlessly, each mile feeling heavier than the last. The hurt gnawed at him, a relentless ache that threatened to consume him. He found himself parked outside a dingy bar on the outskirts of town, a familiar haunt for returning soldiers. The dim interior of the bar enveloped him as he settled onto a bar stool. Matthew stared blankly at the muted television, nursing a beer he couldn't taste. The numbness in his chest slowly gave way to anger. His home had been stolen, his wife had betrayed him, and his son was missing. Yet, his training held him back from acting impulsively. He needed to think, to plan. "Matthew? Matthew Holt, is that you?" A gruff voice cut through his thoughts. Matthew turned to see Richard, a retired soldier he knew from his time in the service. The older man's weathered face creased with concern as he took the seat next to Matthew. "What's eating you, brother?" Richard asked, signaling the bartender for 2 more beers. Matthew hesitated for a moment before the dam broke. He told Richard everything. The betrayal, Jacob's disappearance, the utter loss he felt. Richard listened, his face hardening with each revelation. "You've been played, brother," Richard said, his voice low and intense. "But if Jacob's gone, it's not just an affair. Something bigger is happening. Let me help you find him." Matthew felt a spark of hope for the first time since he'd walked into his changed home. "You do that?" Richard nodded, his eyes glinting with determination. "Of course. We take care of our own. But listen, before you can deal with Amanda and that bastard Nick, you need to make sure Jacob is safe. The disappearance of your son is a puzzle, and we're going to find the pieces." As Richard laid out a plan, Matthew realized he had a new mission. Richard would investigate Jacob's whereabouts while Matthew focused on regaining control of his life. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but now it had direction. "Remember," Richard said, clasping Matthew's shoulder, "Amanda and Nick have underestimated you. Now you have to play the long game. You've survived war zones, Matthew. You'll survive this." Matthew nodded, his jaw set with renewed determination. He had a purpose now, a battle to fight. And this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. The next morning, Matthew returned to the house, his face a mask of calm. This time, he wasn't coming back as the broken man they had expected. He was there to reclaim what was his. Nick answered the door again, his smirk faltering slightly at Matthew's composed demeanor. "What's the matter? Didn't hear us the first time? I'm the owner now." Matthew's voice was quiet, dripping with menace. "You've got until tonight to leave. You don't want me to come back." Amanda appeared behind Nick, her tactics shifting. She attempted to sound reasonable, offering a deal. "Let's not make this messy, Matt. We can split things amicably. You can take some cash and we can move on." But Matthew's steely eyes told her everything she needed to know. There would be no negotiation. "This is my house," Matthew said, his tone brooking no argument. "You've got until sundown to pack up and leave. After that, there won't be any talking. I'll come for what's mine." The coldness in his voice shook Amanda, but she quickly masked her fear behind fake bravado. Matthew turned and walked away, leaving them to stew in the ultimatum he'd delivered. He met Richard at a nearby cafe, the older man already armed with valuable information. "I've got some leads on Jacob," Richard said, his voice low. "It's not good, Matthew. The kid got caught up with a local gang. Dangerous crew that lured him in while you were deployed." Matthew's fists clenched under the table. "How? Why?" Richard's face darkened. "That's the kicker. Seems Amanda's been using your savings to finance her new life with Nick. Jacob, he was forced to turn to alternative means." The betrayal ran even deeper than Matthew had imagined. He now had two battles to fight: reclaim his son and defeat Amanda and Nick. As he absorbed the information, Matthew's resolve hardened. He'd faced worse odds in combat. This was just another war, and he intended to win. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Matthew Holt stood across the street from his house, watching as darkness crept over the neighborhood. His jaw clenched, muscles taut with anticipation. The time for warnings had passed. He crossed the street with purposeful strides, each step bringing him closer to the confrontation he knew was inevitable. Amanda and Nick had arrogantly ignored his ultimatum, believing perhaps that his earlier calm demeanor was a sign of weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Matthew didn't bother knocking. He turned the doorknob, finding it unlocked. As he stepped inside, the scent of unfamiliar cologne assaulted his nostrils once again. Nick's scent. It made his stomach turn. Nick's voice rang out from the living room, cocky and challenging. "Well, look who's back. The washed-up soldier boy." Matthew followed the sound, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. He found Nick lounging on the couch, feet propped up on the coffee table. The man's arrogance was palpable, rolling off him in waves as he smirked up at Matthew. "You're not getting anything, old man," Nick sneered, rising to his feet. He squared his shoulders, attempting to use his muscular frame to intimidate Matthew. "You're washed up. This isn't your home anymore. Why don't you just crawl back to whatever hole you came from?" But Matthew, hardened by combat and steeled by betrayal, showed no fear. His eyes, cold and calculating, never left Nick's face. In that moment, Nick saw something change in Matthew's expression, a flicker of danger that made him hesitate. That split second of hesitation was all Matthew needed. His move was swift and brutal. Before Nick could react, Matthew's fist connected with his jaw, a single calculated blow fueled by months of pent-up rage and betrayal. The crack of bone meeting bone echoed through the room. Nick crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The cocky facade shattered, revealing the coward beneath. A scream pierced the air. Amanda stood in the doorway, her face a mask of horror as she took in the scene before her. Her eyes darted between Matthew, standing tall and unflinching, and Nick, sprawled on the floor, groaning in pain. "What have you done?" she shrieked, fumbling for her phone. "I'm calling the police. You can't just come in here, Anne." But Matthew was already one step ahead. With eerie calm, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "Go ahead, Amanda," he said, his voice low and steady. "Call them. I'm sure they'd be very interested in the contents of this folder." Amanda's hand, clutching her phone, froze mid-air. What is that?" Matthew's lips curled into a cold smile. "Evidence. Every shred of your financial mismanagement. Every penny you funneled to your boy toy here. Every action that would destroy your credibility in court." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Oh, and let's not forget the part where your neglect drove our son into the arms of a dangerous gang." The color drained from Amanda's face. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. You can't just take everything," she pleaded, her voice shaking. But Matthew wasn't interested in her tears or her pleas. He had given her a chance to leave peacefully, and she had squandered it. Now, she and Nick would face the consequences of their actions. "You've made your bed," he said coldly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Now lie in it." He turned his back on them, walking towards the door. Behind him, he could hear Amanda's sobs and Nick's pained groans. But he didn't look back. There was nothing left for him here but ghosts and betrayal. As he stepped out onto the porch, Matthew heard the frantic scrambling inside. Amanda and Nick knew they had no more cards to play. Their hasty retreat was music to his ears. The house was his again, but it was an empty victory. The real battle, he knew, was just beginning. Somewhere out there, his son needed him. And Matthew Holt was a man on a mission. The rundown building loomed before Matthew, its crumbling facade a testament to neglect and despair. This was where Richard had tracked Jacob, a den of lost souls and broken dreams. The gang that had lured his son in was notorious for using young recruits like Jacob to do their dirty work. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the building. Every instinct honed by years of military service screamed danger, but the father in him pushed forward. His son was in there, and nothing would stop him from bringing Jacob home. The interior of the building was a maze of dark corridors and boarded-up rooms. The stench of mold and something far worse assaulted Matthew's nostrils as he navigated the darkness. Muffled voices and the occasional scurrying of rats were his only companions. Finally, he came to a door at the end of a long hallway. Light seeped out from beneath it, a beacon in the gloom. Matthew took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find on the other side. He pushed the door open. The room was small and dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. And there, huddled in the corner, was Jacob. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. His son looked so different from the boy he remembered. Jacob was thinner, gaunt from months of stress and fear. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, speaking of sleepless nights and constant worry. Jacob's head snapped up at the sound of the door opening. His eyes widened, a mix of shame and relief washing over his face as he recognized his father. "Dad," Jacob whispered, his voice cracking. It was clear he had been living in fear, convinced that his mistakes had cost him his family. Matthew crossed the room in 2 quick strides, dropping to his knees beside his son. He wanted nothing more than to wrap Jacob in his arms, to shield him from the world that had been so cruel. But he held back, sensing the fragility of the moment. "I'm here, son," Matthew said softly. "I'm here to take you home." Jacob's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know what else to do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After you left, Mom, and then this guy, Nick." Matthew's jaw clenched at the mention of Nick's name, but he kept his voice steady. "It's okay, Jacob. You can tell me everything." And so, in that dingy room that reeked of desperation, Jacob poured out his story. He told Matthew how the gang had approached him, offering friendship and a sense of belonging when his world was falling apart. How they had used Amanda's neglect and the family's financial ruin as leverage, slowly drawing him deeper into their web. "I tried to leave," Jacob said, his voice cracking. "But they said they'd kill me if I ever tried to get out. I didn't know what else to do, Dad. I'm so sorry." Matthew's heart broke for his son. The boy had been carrying this burden alone for so long, believing he had no one to turn to. In that moment, Matthew's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his son's future. "Listen to me, Jacob," Matthew said, his voice firm but gentle. "None of this is your fault. We're going to get you out of this mess, no matter what it takes. You hear me? We're in this together now." Jacob looked up at his father, hope dawning in his eyes for the first time in months. "Really? You? You don't hate me?" Matthew pulled his son into a fierce embrace. "I could never hate you, Jacob. You're my son. We're family, and family sticks together, no matter what." As he held his son, Matthew's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. He knew they couldn't rely on the police to handle things quickly. The gang's influence in the area ran too deep. No, this was something he would have to take care of himself. His military training would come in handy once again, but this time, the battlefield was his own town. The enemy wasn't some faceless adversary in a foreign land, but a group of thugs who had dared to prey on his son. Matthew Holt had faced down terrorists and warlords. He had survived firefights and ambushes. Now, he would use every skill at his disposal to dismantle this gang and ensure his son's safety. As they left the rundown building, Jacob leaning heavily on his father for support, Matthew's eyes scanned the shadows. He knew the gang wouldn't let Jacob go easily, but they had no idea what they were up against. A soldier, a father, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The war had come home, and Matthew Holt was ready for battle. The alleyway was shrouded in darkness, the feeble light from a single street lamp barely penetrating the gloom. Matthew and Richard stood in the shadows, their bodies tense with anticipation. The trap was set. Now, they waited. Jacob had been the bait, reluctantly agreeing to contact the gang and arrange a meeting. The gang, thinking Jacob was coming to settle his debt, had no idea they were walking into an ambush. Richard glanced at Matthew, noting the cold determination in his friend's eyes. "You sure about this?" he whispered. "It's not too late to call in some backup." Matthew shook his head. "We do this ourselves. The minute we involve anyone else, we risk the gang slipping away. This ends tonight." The sound of approaching footsteps silenced their conversation. Matthew's hand instinctively went to the small of his back, where his service pistol was concealed. He hoped he wouldn't need to use it, but he was prepared for any eventuality. For men rounded the corner, their swagger betraying their overconfidence. The leader, a heavily tattooed man with a shaved head, sneered as he spotted Jacob standing alone in the pool of light from the street lamp. Well, look who decided to show up," the leader said, his voice dripping with malice. "Thought you could run from us, did you, Jake? Time to pay up, boy." Jacob's eyes darted nervously to the shadows where his father waited. The gang leader followed his gaze, his brow furrowing in confusion. That moment of confusion was all Matthew needed. He and Richard burst from the shadows, moving with the practiced precision of seasoned soldiers. Before the gang members could react, Matthew had the leader pinned against the wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. Richard moved with equal speed, disarming the other gang members before they could draw their weapons. Years of military training had honed their skills to a razor's edge, and the gang was woefully unprepared for the onslaught. "Listen carefully," Matthew growled, his face inches from the leader's. "Your little operation is over. You're going to leave my son alone. You're going to leave this neighborhood alone. If I ever hear of you or your boys coming near Jacob again, what happens next will make this look like a picnic. Understood?" The leader's eyes bulged, a mixture of fear and fury in his gaze. He tried to speak, but Matthew's arm against his throat made it impossible. Matthew eased the pressure slightly, allowing the man to gasp for air. "I said, do you understand? You can't do this," the leader wheezed. "You have no idea who you're messing with. We've got connections." Matthew's laugh was cold and humorless. "Connections? Let me tell you about connections." He nodded to Richard, who produced a thick envelope from his jacket. "In this envelope," Matthew continued, "is every shred of evidence of your criminal activities. Drug deals, extortion, recruitment of minors. It's all here. My friend here has some very interesting contacts in law enforcement. One word from us, and this envelope lands on the desk of every federal agency you can think of. The color drained from the gang leader's face as the reality of his situation sank in. His eyes darted to his companions, but they were equally subdued, Richard keeping them in check with a steely gaze. "So here's how this is going to work," Matthew said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to walk away. You're going to forget you ever knew Jacob. You're going to find a new neighborhood to terrorize, preferably one far, far away from here. Because if I ever see you or your boys around here again, I won't be so nice." He released his hold on the leader, stepping back. The man rubbed his throat, coughing and gasping for air. "This isn't over," the leader sputtered, but the threat in his voice rang hollow. Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I think it is. Unless you'd like to find out just how much damage a couple of pissed-off veterans can do before the cops show up." The gang leader's resolve crumbled. With a final glare of impotent rage, he gestured to his men. They backed away slowly, never taking their eyes off Matthew and Richard, before turning and fleeing into the night. As their footsteps faded, Jacob emerged from the shadows where he had been watching the confrontation. His eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and lingering fear. Is it really over?" he asked, his voice trembling. Matthew wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, pulling him close. "It's over, son. They won't bother you again." Richard approached, clapping Matthew on the back. "Nice work, brother. Remind me never to get on your bad side." Matthew managed a small smile, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbing away. "Couldn't have done it without you, Rich. Thanks for having my back." As they walked out of the alley, Matthew felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The gang's grip on Jacob was shattered. His son was safe. For the first time in months, maybe years, Matthew felt like he had truly come home. But as they emerged onto the street, the lights of the city twinkling around them, Matthew knew their journey wasn't over yet. They had won this battle, but the war, the fight to rebuild their family and their lives, was just beginning. Jacob leaned against his father, exhaustion and relief evident in every line of his body. Matthew tightened his arm around his son's shoulders, a fierce protectiveness surging through him. They had a long road ahead, but they would face it together. Father and son, united against whatever challenges lay ahead. As they walked towards home, their real home, Matthew allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. He had reclaimed his house, rescued his son, and put an end to the immediate threat. But even as he savored the victory, a part of him remained vigilant. Amanda and Nick were still out there, and Matthew had no illusions about the battles yet to come. For now, though, he had his son back. They were safe, and that was enough. The rest could wait for tomorrow. The courthouse loomed before Matthew, its stone facade a silent witness to countless battles fought within its walls. This would be his battlefield now, a war of words and evidence rather than bullets and blood. But Matthew Holt was no stranger to war. He straightened his tie, a gesture that felt foreign after months of combat fatigues. Beside him, Jacob fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting around the crowded courthouse steps. Matthew placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "We're in this together." Jacob nodded, but the tension in his shoulders remained. The boy had been through hell, and now he had to relive it all in front of strangers. Matthew's jaw clenched at the thought, but he pushed the anger down. He needed a clear head for what was to come. As they climbed the steps, Matthew caught sight of Amanda and Nick. His soon-to-be ex-wife wore a tailored suit, her hair and makeup immaculate. She looked every inch the wronged spouse, a facade Matthew knew was as false as her vows had been. Nick stood slightly behind her, his cocky smirk noticeably absent. The bruise on his jaw had faded, but the memory of Matthew's fist connecting with it was still fresh for both men. Amanda's eyes met Matthew's for a moment, and he saw a flicker of something, fear, regret, before her mask of indifference slipped back into place. She whispered something to her lawyer, a weasel-faced man in an expensive suit, before disappearing into the courthouse. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low conversation. Matthew recognized a few faces, neighbors, old friends, even some of Jacob's teachers. Word had spread fast about the Holt family drama, and it seemed the whole town had turned out to watch the spectacle. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Matthew steeled himself for the battle ahead. Amanda's lawyer wasted no time in painting Matthew as the villain of the piece. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "my client, Mrs. Holt, has suffered greatly at the hands of her husband, a man who abandoned his family for months on end, who returned from war a changed man, unstable and prone to violence." Matthew's own lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, had warned him about this tactic. They were trying to use his service against him, to twist his sacrifice into something sinister. He kept his face impassive, even as his blood boiled. "We seek half of all marital assets," Amanda's lawyer continued, "including the family home and Mr. Holt's military pension. Furthermore, we believe Mr. Holt to be an unfit father, his prolonged absences and recent violent behavior making him a danger to young Jacob." At this, Jacob stiffened beside Matthew. The boy opened his mouth to protest, but Matthew gently squeezed his arm, silently urging him to stay quiet. Their time would come. As Amanda's lawyer droned on, weaving a tapestry of lies and half-truths, Matthew's mind raced. He thought of the long nights in the desert, of the brothers he'd lost, of the wounds both visible and hidden that he carried. He'd endured all of it, pushed through the pain and the fear, sustained by the thought of coming home to his family. And this was how Amanda repaid that sacrifice? But even as anger threatened to overwhelm him, Matthew remembered his training. Stay calm under fire. Assess the situation. Plan your counterattack. When it was finally their turn, Sarah stood, her posture radiating confidence. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and strong. "The picture painted by the opposition is not just false. It's an insult to every man and woman who has ever served this country." She pulled out a thick folder, the same one Matthew had used to confront Amanda and Nick in their home. "I have here documented evidence of Mrs. Holt's infidelity, her gross financial mismanagement, and her neglect of her son while Mr. Holt was serving overseas." As Sarah laid out their case, Matthew watched the judge's face. The older man's expression remained neutral, but Matthew caught a slight narrowing of his eyes as particularly damning pieces of evidence were presented. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "we have testimony from Jacob Holt himself about the circumstances that led him to fall in with a local gang. Circumstances directly resulting from Mrs. Holt's neglect and her prioritization of her affair over her son's well-being." At this, all eyes in the courtroom turned to Jacob. The boy shrunk under the scrutiny, but Matthew gave him an encouraging nod. Jacob took a deep breath and stood, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger as he spoke. "My mom. She wasn't there," Jacob said, his words cutting through the hushed courtroom. "When Dad was gone, she was always out with Nick. There was never any food in the house, never any money for school stuff. The gang, they said they could help me out, give me a family. I didn't know what else to do." Matthew's heart broke for his son, even as pride swelled in his chest at Jacob's bravery. He risked a glance at Amanda and saw her composed facade crumbling, tears welling in her eyes. Whether they were genuine or just another performance, Matthew couldn't tell. As Jacob sat down, Sarah delivered her closing argument. "Your Honor, Matthew Holt is not just a decorated soldier. He's a dedicated father who has moved heaven and earth to rescue his son from a dangerous situation. A situation created by Mrs. Holt's selfish actions. We ask the court to recognize Mr. Holt's rights as a father and his contributions to this marriage, and to rule accordingly." With that, the first day of the trial came to a close. As they left the courthouse, Matthew felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The battle was far from over, but they had landed the first significant blow. "You did good in there, son," Matthew said to Jacob as they walked to the car. "I'm proud of you." Jacob managed a small smile, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Thanks, Dad. Do you think we're going to win?" Matthew looked back at the courthouse, his expression determined. "I don't know, Jacob, but I promise you this, I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on our home, not on anything. We're going to fight this to the end." As they drove home, Matthew's mind was already racing, planning their next move. Amanda and Nick had shown their hand, and now he knew exactly what he was up against. The war wasn't over, But Matthew Holt had never lost a battle he couldn't afford to lose. And he sure as hell wasn't going to start now. The trial dragged on, each day bringing new revelations and bitter confrontations. But as the proceedings continued in the courtroom, a different kind of battle was being waged outside its walls. Nick, desperate to salvage what he could from the wreckage of his life, had embarked on a vicious smear campaign against Matthew. Whispers and rumors spread through the town like wildfire, painting Matthew as an unstable, abusive monster. "I heard he came back from the war all messed up in the head," one neighbor confided to another over their fence. Amanda was terrified of him. "That's why she had to leave." "Poor woman," the other neighbor clucked sympathetically. "And that boy of theirs, no wonder he fell in with a bad crowd. Probably trying to escape his father's rages." The lies gained traction, fueled by the town's appetite for gossip and Nick's relentless campaign. Matthew found himself on the receiving end of suspicious glances and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. But Matthew remained calm, a skill honed through years of high-pressure situations. He knew the truth would prevail, but he couldn't sit idly by while his reputation was dragged through the mud. With quiet determination, Matthew began to gather statements from those who knew him best. Former colleagues from his unit, neighbors who had known the family for years, even Jacob's teachers, all willing to testify to Matthew's character and dedication as a father. Sergeant Mike Donovan, Matthew's former commanding officer, wrote a particularly powerful statement. "I've known Matthew Holt for over a decade, in peacetime and in war. He's one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege of serving with. The idea that he would ever raise a hand to his family is not just false, it's offensive to everything Matthew stands for." As these statements began to circulate, the tide of public opinion slowly started to turn. People began to question the narrative Nick had spun, to see the desperation behind his actions. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Amanda was growing increasingly frantic. The evidence against her was mounting, and she could feel control of the situation slipping away. In a moment of panic-driven desperation, she made a critical mistake. Late one night, Amanda approached Mrs. Jensen, Jacob's former math teacher and a key witness for Matthew's side. The two women met in a dimly lit parking lot, Amanda's eyes darting nervously as she pressed an envelope into Mrs. Jensen's hands. "I know Matthew's asked you to testify," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm begging you, please don't. This is for your trouble. Just tell the court you can't remember anything clearly. Please." Mrs. Jensen stared at the envelope in shock, then back at Amanda's pleading face. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving Amanda alone in the darkness. The next morning, Mrs. Jensen went straight to the judge's chambers, the unopened envelope in hand. Her voice shook as she recounted Amanda's attempt to bribe her, but her resolve was firm. As news of the bribery attempt spread, it was like a bomb had gone off in the middle of the trial. Amanda's credibility, already hanging by a thread, was utterly destroyed. The carefully constructed image of the wronged wife crumbled, revealing the desperate, manipulative woman beneath. Nick, sensing the shifting winds, attempted to distance himself from Amanda. But it was too late. His own actions, the smear campaign against Matthew, were now viewed in a new light. The town that had been so quick to believe his lies now turned on him with equal fervor. In the courtroom, Matthew watched as Amanda crumbled under cross-examination. Her lawyer, sensing defeat, tried to salvage what he could, but the damage was done. As Amanda stumbled through weak explanations and transparent lies, Matthew felt no joy, only a deep, aching sadness for what their family had become. Jacob, sitting beside his father, leaned in close. "Is it over, Dad?" he whispered. Matthew put an arm around his son's shoulders. "Almost, buddy, almost." As the day's session came to a close, Matthew stepped out of the courthouse to find a crowd gathered. But this time, there were no suspicious glares or whispered accusations. Instead, he was met with supportive nods and words of encouragement. "We're with you, Matthew," old Mr. Peterson called out. "You show him what a real man looks like." Matthew nodded in acknowledgement, gratitude welling up inside him. The tide had turned, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion as well. Amanda and Nick's downfall was complete, their web of lies unraveling in spectacular fashion. As he drove home with Jacob, Matthew allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The war wasn't over, but victory was finally within reach. And for the first time in a long time, Matthew Holt could see a future beyond the battlefield, a future with his son, in their home, free from the shadows of betrayal and lies. The final battle was at hand, and Matthew was ready to claim his hard-fought victory. The courtroom was packed on the day of the final ruling. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging over the assembled crowd. Matthew sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead. Beside him, Jacob fidgeted nervously, his gaze darting between his father and the judge's empty chair. Across the aisle, Amanda looked a shadow of her former self. Gone was the composed, confident woman who had started this legal battle. In her place sat a haggard, defeated figure, her eyes rimmed with dark circles, her once immaculate appearance now disheveled. Nick was conspicuously absent, having fled town in the wake of the bribery scandal. As the bailiff called the court to order, Matthew felt a calm settle over him. This was it, the culmination of months of struggle, pain, and perseverance. Whatever happened next, he knew he had fought with everything he had. The judge, a stern-faced man with graying hair, took his seat and surveyed the courtroom. His gaze lingered for a moment on Matthew, then on Amanda, before he cleared his throat and began to speak. In the matter of Holt versus Holt, the judge began, his voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. This court has carefully considered all evidence presented, as well as the testimony of all relevant parties. Matthew felt Jacob's hand slip into his own, squeezing tightly. He returned the pressure, a silent reassurance passing between father and son. It is the finding of this court, the judge continued, that the plaintiff, Matthew Holt, has provided substantial and compelling evidence of Mrs. Holt's infidelity, financial misconduct, and neglect of her parental duties. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Matthew remained still, his face impassive, even as his heart raced. Furthermore, the judge went on, his tone growing stern, the attempt to bribe a witness, as proven beyond doubt, is a grave offense that this court cannot overlook. Amanda seemed to shrink in her seat, her lawyer placing a comforting hand on her arm. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that full custody of the minor, Jacob Holt, be awarded to his father, Matthew Holt. Jacob's grip on Matthew's hand tightened, a small gasp escaping him. Matthew allowed himself a small smile, squeezing his son's hand in return. Additionally, the judge continued, Mr. Holt shall retain sole ownership of the family home and all assets therein. Mrs. Holt's claim to Mr. Holt's military pension is hereby denied. The judge paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom once more. This court also recommends that the district attorney's office review the evidence of Mrs. Holt's financial misconduct and the attempted bribery of a witness for potential criminal charges. A shocked silence fell over the courtroom, broken only by a choked sob from Amanda. Matthew felt no joy at her distress, only a profound relief that justice had been served. This court is adjourned, the judge concluded, bringing down his gavel with a resounding crack. The courtroom erupted into a buzz of conversation. Matthew stood slowly, turning to embrace Jacob. It's over, son, he said softly. We did it. As they made their way out of the courtroom, Matthew caught sight of Amanda being led away by her lawyer. For a brief moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Matthew saw the full weight of her actions crash down upon her. The arrogance, the betrayal, the desperate attempts to cling to a life built on lies. It had all come to nothing. Amanda's eyes filled with tears as she was ushered out a side door, disappearing from Matthew's life just as suddenly as she had upended it. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. News of the verdict had spread quickly. As Matthew and Jacob emerged, they were met with a round of applause and words of congratulation. You did it, Matthew, old Mrs. Peterson called out, her weathered face beaming. You showed him what a real hero looks like. Matthew nodded in acknowledgement, gratitude welling up inside him. These were the people who had stood by him, who had seen through the lies and stood for the truth. Their support had meant more than they could ever know. As the crowd dispersed, Matthew and Jacob made their way to the car. The future stretched out before them, no longer shadowed by uncertainty and betrayal. "What now, Dad?" Jacob asked as they pulled away from the courthouse. Matthew glanced at his son, seeing not the scared, gaunt boy he had rescued from the gang, but a young man beginning to come into his own. "Now," he said with a smile, "we go home." The drive was quiet, both father and son lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled up to the house, their house, now and forever, Matthew felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. They climbed the porch steps together, Matthew's hand resting on Jacob's shoulder. For a moment, they simply stood there, taking in the sight of their home, the place they had fought so hard to reclaim. "You know," Matthew said softly, "when I was over there, in the war, this is what kept me going. The thought of coming home to you, to our family. It didn't turn out quite the way I imagined, but—" He trailed off, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Jacob looked up at his father, understanding in his eyes. "But we're here now," he finished. "Together." Matthew nodded, swallowing hard. "Together," he agreed. As they stepped inside, closing the door on the outside world, Matthew Holt knew that the war was finally, truly over. Not just the one he had fought overseas, but the one he had been fighting since his return. He had reclaimed his home, his son, and his life. The battles had been hard-fought, but the victory was sweet. In the days that followed, Matthew and Jacob fell into a new rhythm. They repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, erasing the last traces of Amanda and Nick's presence. It was a process of healing, of reclaiming their space and making it truly theirs again. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jacob turned to his father. "Dad," he said hesitantly, Are you happy?" Matthew considered the question, looking out over the neighborhood he had once feared lost to him. He thought of the struggles they had overcome, the bonds they had forged and strengthened. He thought of the future stretching out before them, full of possibility. "Yeah, son," he said finally, a smile spreading across his face. "I am. We've got each other. We've got our home. That's all I need to be happy." Jacob nodded, a matching smile on his face. "Me too, Dad. Me too." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Matthew Holt knew that while scars remained, they had emerged stronger. The war was over, and they had won. Not just the battle, but their lives back. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.